What up, meatheads? This is Travis, American Butcher. In this episode of the Meat Block, we're going to be talking about antibiotics. And before we get started, I just want to say, I hope everyone had a happy new year and a great holiday season. And you got everything you wanted, if that was spending time with your family or some time alone. Maybe what you really wanted out of the holiday season was seeing the faces of your friends and family when you gave them gifts. Maybe you feel like giving some more, perhaps. And if that's the case, open up the Apple Podcast app, type in the Meat Block, leave a comment, and give a 5-star review. I know it sounds simple, but why haven't you done it yet? It may seem petty, but it really does help with getting the show out to more listeners. Anyway, buckle in, sit down, because we're starting 2018 off with a bang. An antibiotic bang.
Good cutting enhances the quality of good meat. In his way, the meat cutter is an artist. Poor cutting results in an inferior piece of meat, regardless of quality.
The reason I love the Meat Block and I guess hosting it is it's allowing me to build what I think is a community where people could talk and send feedback and whatnot. And I always want people to never fear asking questions or making corrections. It took me well into my 20s to realize I didn't have a problem admitting when I was wrong. Before that, I would have come off as more of a narcissist than I am now. But luckily, that usually fades with adolescence. And because I want the Meat Block to be, driven by the listeners and you, that's you who's listening to this right now. It's very intimate. It's, if you think about it, I'm 2 inches away from a microphone. So it's like I'm right here in your ear whispering. And I want to say thanks for allowing me to be that close to you. This isn't my show. This isn't Ryan's show. This isn't David's show. This is your show. There wouldn't be no show if people didn't listen to it. The reason I want to do this is because I want to stop misinformation. And the reason for this episode in particular, the antibiotic episode, is because of feedback I got when we did our corn or grass-fed episode. You could go back and listen to it. It's in the archive. And in that episode, I did my piece. And I got some feedback from Jordan at Goss Farms. He said on Instagram that it was a great show, but he had a bone to pick with me. He felt I downplayed the consequences of antibiotics. And I went back and listened to it. And I could see his point. In that episode, it wasn't an antibiotic episode, but I brought it up and therefore made it part of the conversation and didn't really elaborate too much on it. When I started in the industry, we used to get these old coal dairy cows that essentially would be taken off preventative antibiotics long enough so they would get out of the system. If the USDA were to do a KISS test, they would test negatively, and we would slaughter them. And we would receive 40 cows on Thursday, and right when we were leaving, and by the time we got there on Friday, a couple of them would have died from exposure, traveling, freaking out because they're in a different environment. They haven't been milked. They're swollen. They have mastitis. They're all sorts of fucked up. And that's what I was used to as far as antibiotics, that the antibiotics in their system was keeping them alive until they got slaughtered. And once they were off of that some of them didn't survive it to the slaughterhouse. This was several years ago, and later David talks about new legislation that has changed this, which I wasn't aware until I was editing this episode. So what I was used to is no longer the way they do it. And I briefly mentioned that in the episode. something, just a very abbreviated version of that abbreviated story I just stated. Now, I view antibiotics as a quote-unquote hot button issue in our industry, where I didn't want to be strongly opposed or strongly against. And I always like to play devil's advocate on the meat block when I feel that some of the stories or pieces are leaning heavily against one way. I want to not villainize that other way. I don't want to say all antibiotics are bad when essentially it helps small farmers save sick animals and it helps feed the masses. What it also does is push margins for larger corporations to make billionaires richer. And like many of you know who work in the industry, we have a lot of industry people listening to the show. We fortunately have the luxury of some quality meat, some, be it organic is your fancy. If you're a butcher, you probably have, you probably are able to get some nice meat that you stand behind ethically. A lot of people in America and a lot of people in the world don't have that luxury. When people are trying to save every penny and get the most out of their paycheck to feed their families, it's genuinely what's on sale and what is pre-made or cooked, be that a drive-through or a hearty meal. I think it's unfortunate if people want to eat healthy, ethically, organic, all natural, grass-fed, grass-finished, insert buzzword, other things, that it genuinely costs a lot more than what the average lower income American can afford to spend. There's this underlining shaming I find in this industry where people look down at people who are doing their best but still could only afford to eat like shit. There's something broken in our food system. Fortunately, there's new legislation that passed in 2017 that is helping keeping Americans free of excess antibiotics. Here's Ryan.
My wife and I have certainly had our lives saved by this wonder drug called antibiotics. I had meningitis once. That explains a lot, right? You might be saying. Ha, fuck you. And my wife had a horrible abscess in her stomach that antibiotics eventually helped clear up. I think the main takeaway here is that we received high doses of antibiotics at a time when it was medically appropriate to use them. The result was very effective. It seems that the problem is with the low doses of antibiotics that find their way into the cleaning products we use, hand wash, part of human medicine, and as part of food animal production. Once again, it is the constant low doses of these antibiotics that seem to be the problem, not the high doses used correctly to treat illness. The guy who discovered penicillin, Sir Alexander Fleming, he won the Nobel Prize in 1945 for his work. He said, "It's not difficult to make microbes resistant to penicillin in the laboratory by exposing them to concentrations not sufficient to kill them. And the same thing has occasionally happened in the body. The time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there's the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant." End quote. It's worth talking more about food animal production because there's more antibiotics sold in the U.S. for use in agriculture than for human use. Agricultural usage accounts for 80% of all antibiotics used in the United States. Antibiotic use in food animal production has a history that's tied to the rise of the CAFO, the concentrated animal feeding operation. As these high-density feedlots became a cornerstone of American livestock production, it was observed that the animals got sick easier and more often when being finished at the CAFO. Antibiotics were a logical choice to bolster their health and help them survive this awful situation. It was then discovered that the antibiotics actually promoted faster growth in these animals. And since faster growth was the goal, it became standard practice to administer low doses of antibiotics to all the livestock when in feedlots. This practice has had and continues to have disastrous outcomes for planetary and human health. It gives rise to superbugs. Here's an article by Dan Charles on this subject. It's an NPR article. There's a global campaign to force meat producers to rein in their use of antibiotics on pigs, chickens, and cattle. European countries, especially Denmark and the Netherlands, have taken the lead. The U.S. is moving, haltingly, towards similar restrictions. Now the concerns about rampant antibiotic use appear to have reached China, where meat production and antibiotic use have been growing fast. Half the pigs in the world live in China, a consequence of the country's swelling appetite for pork. And like pork producers in many other countries, Chinese farmers have turned to antibiotics and other feed additives to control disease in their herds and also to make the animals grow faster. The exact extent of antibiotic use in Chinese agriculture is unknown because authorities don't monitor it, but researchers have sometimes found disturbingly high levels of antibiotic residues in manure from Chinese pig farms. A study published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science adds to evidence that antibiotic use by Chinese pork producers poses health risks. According to the study, manure from pig farmers doesn't just contain antibiotic residues. It also carries high concentrations of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. This increases the risk that antibiotic resistance will move into bacteria that infect humans, and the resulting diseases will be more difficult to treat. But there's also good news. Scientists from the Chinese Academy of Science who took the lead in the new study are increasingly aware of the problem and looking for ways to fight it. They invited James Tiedje, Tiedje, a microbiologist from the Michigan State University, to join their effort. They were quite forthcoming, Tiedje tells The Salt. The Chinese scientists monitored antibiotic residues in manure from 3 different pig farms. They found plenty, but not at exceptionally high levels. TJ then tested those manure samples, looking for genes that make bacteria resistant to particular antibiotics. That's when he hit the jackpot. He found more than 100 different resistant genes. The concentration of resistant genes was almost 200 times higher in these samples compared to manure from a pig farm that had never used antibiotics. We're not trying to single out the Chinese here. This is a global problem, says TJ. Similar levels of antibiotic residues, for instance, have been found in manure on European farms. The study indicates that treating the manure after it leaves the farm can significantly reduce the potential for this manure to spread antibiotic resistance to other bacteria in the surrounding environment. Composting it, for instance, cuts the total population of microbes in manure, which means fewer microbes carrying antibiotic-resistant genes.
Some years ago, I was working in Vermont on a poultry line. I was the stunner. I would kill the chickens with an electric knife, and I'd kill about 1,000 to 1,500 a day. And we only did chickens one day a week, and it was on a Friday. Someone else would hang them. Some days I'd hang them, and I'd learn fun things like you could only manipulate, I think, no more than 8 birds at a time. And if you have 2 in each hand or 3 in each hand, 1 under your arms and 2 between your legs, you'll be surprised how many birds you could hold safely. I say. And I was fairly green back then. New in the industry, didn't really know about food safety, didn't really think butchery was going to be my career. I thought it was just a job. I was affected by the 2008 recession. Before that, I was a journeyman tile setter in Santa Barbara, California. And when people weren't redoing houses and the market collapsed or whatever, the bubble burst, my company decided to go with cheaper labor. And that's how I found myself in Vermont, killing chickens. That's how I got into the industry. And back then I smoked. And killing birds, you would learn to, work in these long shifts, learn to hold your pee. You would go out to the holding pens or the receiving area where usually someone would have a lit cigarette just burning on a shelf, and you'd take a couple drags of it, and then someone else would take a couple puffs. I would usually have a chew in, and I'd be spitting in the blood trough, pounding rock stars. So there was a lot of hand-to-mouth coordination and a lot of birds. So washing my hands and food safety wasn't even on my radar. And if you've ever been in a chicken house or manipulated birds or used crates, and when you hang them upside down, there's a lot of dander and there's a lot of porous shit in the air. And the big concern people have is salmonella. Salmonella is easy to kill. You could genuinely kill it with only 70-degree water and it rinses off. What's worse and more common is Campylobacter. A lot of small poultry operations do a slush ice intervention. This is where you put a bird in liquid ice almost. It's water that is about just above freezing with ice. It's called an ice bath. And in this water, you do an intervention. You add sometimes chlorine. There's a chemical called Chick X. And there's other interventions that I forget the names of. But essentially, you're trying to achieve a certain BPM, parts per million, where the antimicrobial intervention will kill these at a certain level. You're looking for a 7 log reduction. But usually, this chemical is added to the water and not the ice. So when the ice melts, it dissipates. It weakens. And when you keep adding birds into the same lugger, the log reduction shortens. Now the USDA does random checks for salmonella, and a lot of them come back negative. Now, of those random for salmonella, a lot of those birds come back positive for Campylobacter. I caught Campylobacter. Now, I didn't get it because I bought a chicken or manipulating it in the packaging state. I got it from poor SSOPs in essentially putting bird shit in my mouth without knowing it. Sometimes when you would electrically stun a bird, all their muscles would seize up and a stream of shit would fly straight into your face. Fool me once, shame on. What I'm saying is you can't fool a fool. Alright, I don't know if anyone got that deep cut, but I ended up wearing a face shield as a result of this first incident. But I would still sneak out to the holding pens, take a couple puffs, and get back on the line. I woke up one morning with a strong pain in my stomach. I felt like I was being knifed. By the time I made it to the bathroom, I was leaking out of both ends. I went to the hospital, gave a stool sample, they tested it, and I came back positive for Campylobacter. To tell you the severity of this, the CDC then called me and asked how I could have possibly have gotten this. I explained to them my vocation, and that was the end of the phone call. I believe the statistic I read was 1 out of 33,000 people get the disease, and myself and my brother have both had it, along with other employees at that poultry plant. I once saw someone move a pallet with a pallet jack, put a hose that was laying in chicken gut, a trough trench, in his mouth so he could get the pallet jack on the other side of it. That person is still alive. Once diagnosed, I was put on a slew of antibiotics. And after about a week of shitting my pants and shitting my bed and shitting anywhere I ever was, I was cured. I felt fine. I went back to work, made my boss buy me a ventilator to help against chicken dander, and encouraged my employer to do weekly SSOP and GMP meetings and enforce employee safety just as much as food safety. A month later, I'm on the kill floor. I'm training someone how to gut a pig. And before we would open up the carcass, after the scalder, we would rinse them thoroughly to make sure that there was no hair, no fecal, or no ingesta. And we would do this at the drop spreader right before evisceration. At this plant, once the hog was open, we couldn't rinse it anymore. And by open, I mean eviscerated or gutted. Once you started that process, if there was any contamination on the carcass, it had to be trimmed off. That's how it was at this plant. Some other plants still may allow you to use a hose depending on their food safety program or their HACCP program. So right before I eviscerate a pig, I make sure it's thoroughly cleaned before I cut into it. And I start at the top, near the H-bone, which is the bottom, because the pig is hanging upside down. Does that make sense? So I was training someone to do this. The first step is to make your cut and then pop the H-bone. But, as I said, I wanted to wash the pig. I pointed out where there was some shit that needed to be sprayed off, and as I went to point, his knife came down and popped the H-bone with my index finger on it. Severing my top tendon, my finger was more off than on. I went to go see Dr. Summeroff. As I'm leaving to go to the hospital, the cut room manager comes up and says, "You need to go to Brattleboro if you want to get good pills. Not the hospital here in Bellows Falls. Also, since I told you that, if they give you anything good, you owe me some, and I'll buy the rest." Feeding this person's addiction was the last thing on my mind. As I'm walking towards the car, the employee who should have just sprayed my hand with water and not cut my finger practically off runs up to apologize. I politely, yet firmly, tell him to fuck off and get away from me. About a week later, he got picked up for a parole violation. Apparently, smoking crack was not part of his condition of release. And when the cops searched his car, they found a bunch of equipment that had my company's name written all over it. So, fuck that guy. What does this have to do with antibiotics? Well, I'll tell you. When there's potential for pig shit to get into your bloodstream, they give you all kinds of antibiotics to ensure that you don't die from blood poisoning, such as Cipro and others that I forget. I was supposed to be out of work for 3 months. After 2 weeks, I returned to work with my arm in a sling to train people. I also practiced with my left hand, and about the time I got my cast and my stitches out, I woke up with that same familiar pain that I had when I had Campylobacter and shit my bed. I'm thinking this is turning out to be quite the year. Knowing the symptoms all too well, I return to the urgent care and give a stool sample. Negative for Campylobacter. But apparently what happened as a result of me catching Campylobacter and the slew of antibiotics I was put on to kill that infectious disease, and the result of having my finger partially amputated and reattached with the fear of pig shit in it, those antibiotics, combined with the others, nuked my system and killed my gut bacteria. I feel it's important for someone who is practicing medicine. By the way, why do they call it practicing? You should be good by now. But anyway, if you're practicing medicine, you should encourage people who are on antibiotics to take probiotics, because something as simple as drinking kefir would have prevented me from months and almost years of stomach pain. Now I avoid certain foods that's going to upset my stomach. I'm that asshole at a party or at a dinner that has dietary restrictions. I hate being that person. Here's David.
Antibiotics and meats. Something we hear about a ton, especially in retail shops. Whether you're seeing it on packaging as a marketing tool, absolutely no antibiotics ever used in our farms, something like that, or you're being asked by a customer about it, it's quite prevalent in our line of work. Antibiotics in livestock are used in the same way they are in humans for treatments of disease. They were previously used in feed and water for animals as kind of a preemptive measure to promote growth and resilience, but that was outlawed in the U.S. at the beginning of 2017, and it had been banned in Europe since 2006. Most of the consumers' concern revolve around antibiotics causing superbugs in livestock that will outpace our own ability to treat them by becoming resilient and mutating into something untreatable. The second fear is that drugs, through a residual amount, will be found in muscle tissue and will enter our food chain and cause the same problems with us, combined with doctors' rampant overuse of them. Antibiotics can be, when used judiciously, a very helpful tool in the conventional farming system regulating animals' health. As a certified organic producer myself, I cannot ever administer them to any of my livestock, and if I elect to treat an animal to save its life, if need be, that animal is forever pulled from the organic program and then goes into the conventional system. I've often had animals come through the slaughterhouse that had signs of previous illness or infection upon dressing them out. The USDA has measures in place to make sure that drugs do not enter the food chain because it can show up in muscle residue. The fact is, drugs can show up in edible tissues after slaughter, after being administered. And that's why the USDA requires a withdrawal period after the administering of drugs to an animal for at least 30 days. Now, inspectors are empowered to test for these residues whenever they see fit. If they suspect an animal may not have completed the withdrawal period, or oftentimes it can be done randomly, as determined, the inspector performs what is known as a KISS test. Now, the way that works is the KISS test, or the KIS test, it's a swab test. It's used to detect antimicrobial drugs in fresh or thawed kidney tissue. So the KISS test is most frequently used by the USDA FSIS inspectors. Basically what it does, it's super easy to perform. You cut open the kidney with the cap to the test. You collect a sample with a little swab. You turn the swab mix kind of over itself with the cap back on, and then you put it in a little incubator that the FSIS inspector has in his office. It takes about 3 hours to get the results, happens right there. Then they can know whether or not that animal has to be condemned or if it can, in fact, enter the food chain. Now,
this technician prepares a foreign sample to be tested for possible residue. Since chemicals are absorbed into the meat fat, the first step is to draw off the fat. The chemist heats a sample in an oven and pours the fat into a flask. To this, he adds solvents and extracts chemicals from the fat. He then applies the extract to chromatic paper. This is tedious, time-consuming work, but it pays dividends in consumer protection. The chemist now exposes the paper to ultraviolet light. Each one produces its own characteristic pattern in definite positions. When chemicals are shown to be present, another machine, a gas chromatograph, can be used to determine how much. This device is so sensitive that minute traces, even 1 part in a million, can be recorded. Such highly sensitive and precise laboratory methods increase the meat inspector's ability to assure thorough protection for your meat supply.
This is an incredibly important and useful tool, and they've made it really efficient for on-the-spot testing. Now, what are some things that perhaps would cause an FSIS inspector to question the integrity of a carcass? I've got some guidelines here found on the FSIS.usda.gov website. It says the inspector is to perform a KISS test on any carcass suspected of containing violative levels of chemical residues and on any carcass exhibiting signs of systemic conditions. The inspector is to use professional judgment when selecting carcasses for chemical or drug residue testing based on evidence or acute, subacute disease conditions, pathological lesions, production practices, herd history, environmental exposure, and threats to homeland security. The inspector is to test animals for chemical residues when they are identified as a U.S. suspect for chemical residues during antemortem inspection, and when postmortem findings may indicate antimicrobial treatment or exposure, even if the carcass and its parts have been condemned. The following list contains descriptions of pathologies and conditions that may warrant testing of carcasses for chemical residues. Residue testing may be appropriate when these conditions are observed. Number 1, mastitis. During antemortem, signs of mastitis can vary based on the severity and duration of infection and may exhibit varying degrees of clinical signs, from pus-like or discolored discharge from the teats, redness, and swelling of the udder, to no visible signs in the udder at all. Postmortem conditions are carcasses with inflammatory ventral edema, or hemorrhages or yellow discharges coming from the udders or the mammary glands. Metritis, peritonitis. This is a finding of surgical devices like a suture, toggles, anything like that. Subcutaneous inflammation. Injection sites. This is a big one. I see these all the time in rumps and in shoulders. They may find them while the animal is still alive in antemortem or postmortem after we've sided it. And you see these carcasses with lesions associated with injections. They can be found in a variety of locations, including the neck, shoulder, thorax, ventral abdomen, flank, hindquarter, pelvic area, and tail. A lot of farmers. We've had a couple guys come through the slaughterhouse, and they've tried to hide them in creative areas, but it just ends up having a huge lesion, and it's really obvious. There's some other things upon evisceration that may tip them off. Signs of pneumonia, pleurisy, pericarditis, which is inflammation of the heart sac, endocarditis, and just kind of generalized local disease, carcasses that have elevated body temperature, congested mucous membranes, dehydration, just general poor body condition. Other things that may tip them off could be like inflammatory conditions, arthritis. Oftentimes we see animals coming in from feedlots they've been standing on cement their entire life, and their joints are super swelled up and just full of fluid, absolutely full of fluid. If a producer is found in violation of the antibiotic withdrawal policy, then they're added to an offender list. If it happens more than once, they're added to a repeat offender list, and then every animal that they bring through to slaughter is then tested until they've been clear for a determined amount of time by the field vet. This is something that the FSIS takes very seriously, and inspectors that I've worked with have been very proactive with their testing, and it's something that I feel very safe about. And when I explain this to customers that want to know about antibiotic use, having this sort of explanation about their policies and the things that they do really goes a long way to help kind of bolster consumer confidence, because I think that there is a bit of distrust in the industry. And so I encourage everybody out there to look further into these policies and routines that the FSIS and USDA has for testing, because it's really set up to keep the drugs out of the food chain. Nobody wants antibiotics in their meat, and it's not, producers really don't. Often, well, the majority of producers aren't trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes as far as this goes. Take a look at the FSIS.gov website and familiarize yourself with these procedures. And even in a retail setting, this information can be very, very helpful as far as consumer confidence and talking to the people that we inevitably get that walk up to the counter and say, I don't care if it says organic, you guys are lying and I'm not buying this meat, because you always get somebody like that. Until next time.
I had a wrench in my hand. I was my mama's little angel, my daddy's second chance. He went end over end. The first year he went pro and he lost part of his eyesight, so he couldn't race no more. He never lost his touch when he got under a hood. He knew how to make 'em run. He knew one day he would see his name in victory lane and engraved on that cup, just like all them other crazy fools are racing in their blood.
All right, meatheads, that's going to do it for this week's episode of The Meat Block. I hope you enjoyed it, Antibiotics, and I hope you had a safe and happy New Year's. And I'm looking forward to 2018. I think it's going to be a great year, and I just want to say, if you want to do something in life, just do it. Make 2018 your year to achieve some goal. And if you announce you're going to do something, the likelihood of you doing it is more. Let's say you want to write a book, and you're entertaining the idea. Now, if you just say, I'm going to write a book, and you tell people, it forces you to do it. Also, there's this thing called Parkinson's Law, that if you allow yourself a year to do something, or 6 weeks to do something, the amount of time you allow yourself is how long it's going to take. So don't drag your ass. Set realistic goals and achieve them. My goals, personally, for 2018 involve building a recording studio downstairs and building a website. I would be interested in knowing what your 2018 goals or resolutions are. And a great way to let me know that, or let us know that, is head over to the Facebook group, The Meat Block, and just let us know. Say, hey, in 2018, I want to achieve this, or whatever. And if you want to get a hold of us, one way to do that is to email us at themeatblockpodcast@gmail.com. Tweet us, even though no one does, at themeatblockpod, or Instagram, which is the best way, at themeatblock. Again, the Facebook page is also a good way to contact us. You can also contact Ryan at Gather and Break on Instagram, David at A Farm Butcher on Instagram, and I am at American Butcher on Instagram and Facebook. And if you want to help the show, the best way to do that is type in The Meat Block in your podcast search app, whatever that may be. Let's say it's Apple Podcast. Then leave 5 stars and a comment. Another way to support us is going on social media and tagging us or using the hashtag #TheMeatBlock. That would be awesome. Intro is Ring the Bell, and this outro song is Drive By Trucker's Daddy's Cup. And until next time, keep your knives sharp and live in the margin.
Out all the glass and we welded up the doors. Well, the first time that I raced, my qualifying was a shame. I started out way in the back and came back about the same. Pulled her in the pit, couldn't look my daddy in the eye. He said, if you quit now, son, it's gonna haunt you all your life. See, it ain't about the money or even being number one. You gotta know when it's all over, you did the best you could have done. And knowing that it's in you and you never let it out was worse than blowing any engine or any wreck you'll ever have. Since then I wrecked a bunch of cars, then I broke a bunch of bones. It's anybody's race out there, and I learned to run my own. I'd shove them in the wall, and I'd hit them from behind. I'd let them know that I was there. I'd let them know that track was mine. It's been several years since my daddy passed away, but his picture's on my dash every time I go to race. I lost more than I won, but I ain't gonna give up till they put me in the ground and daddy's name is on that cup. I'm sorry, I didn't look at you.
No, I wasn't looking. I was listening to the story, man. That's great.